Hello! The Great Canadian Bagel here, coming to you with the Quebec provincial election Postmortem. So I'll get into the specifics of where our methodology went wrong or where the methodology worked quite well here and any changes I've done later, but first we're just going to go the basic realities of what happened here. So the general synopsis basically is the CAQ has swept basically every single francophone riding except the extremely urban ones. And most of the francophone minority ridings went to Liberals. And that's almost entirely where the Liberals are left. I don't know, I didn't look specifically, but I think some of the ridings in Montreal that they have won are not technically francophone minority ridings, but most of them are. The ones the Liberals won, that is. The Parti Québécois has been reduced to really just the most easternmost bit of Quebec over here, with Matin Metapedi. I don't know how to pronounce his writing at all. My French sucks. Which possibly only went their way because of a very popular, very well-known incumbent. Ile de la Madeleine was razor-thin margin, and probably, if you did this election 100 times without previous information, it probably would be close to 50-50, honestly. And Camillère-Lorne, which likely only went Parti Québécois because the Quebec Solidaire candidate dropped out, and the second choice votes of that person, or that candidate, ended up breaking Parti Québécois, which not that surprising because again, Parti Québécois, I said before, the polling had Parti Québécois or Quebec Solidaire to Parti Québécois about 50% conversion, so a very high number. So at this point, yes, you do have this this gargantuan seat advantage, and yes, proportionally, it's a very disproportional election result. Conservatives got 0 seats, though not for lack of trying, because Boyce North and Boyce South here were razor thin, and likely, again, as with Ile de la Madeleine, if you ran that 100 times, you'd probably get close to 50-50 in those districts. So, the other thing that should be noted here is that this election was relatively good for the polls. My model underperformed, but the overall polling wasn't too bad. And I will even note my model didn't do the worst. It did better than some of these polls before you take into account any decisions I've made to change it. I outperformed Ecos and Angus Reid, notably, but we'll get into that in a second. So, as you can see here, if we look at the Quebec Liberal column, pretty much everyone except the last Leisure poll was, or the Leisure Research Co. and Angus Reid polls were very, very close. This is just their last polls published. The last Leisure poll slightly overestimates them, but not wildly so. I want to double check this real quick. I wrote the right number. I did right. Okay, cool. I just want to make sure I wrote the right number there. For the CAQ, other than Main Street and Research Co., everyone underestimated them quite a bit, but that was expected on my end, and I corrected for this. And some people might think I might have overcorrected CAQ in my my modeling. I don't think so, but we'll get into that in a second. The big one here for my model was Quebec Solidaire and Parti Québécois, which again, we'll get in a moment. Overall, the polling, other than Main Street and Ecos, is all solid for Quebec Solidaire. Being off by about a point with Research Co., or 1.4 I should say, not a big deal. Main Street did way better than Ecos. Ecos missed by 5.2. That's a huge miss, and they had a corresponding large miss with the CAQ. Not particularly good polling there. Parti Québécois was... Some of the pollsters did quite good. Ecos, surprisingly. Ledger did good. Main Street also did good. Sagma, a little low, but decent on Parti Québécois. Overall, it was decent, but it was a very last-minute thing, which I will show you in a second. And for the Conservatives, everyone but Ecos overestimated them, and some people, like Angus Reid, and to a lesser extent Main Street, overestimated them quite a bit. And this is one of the things I was worried about, particularly the Main Street result, in my model, over-relying on the one pollster because how my model functions, which considers every poll from every pollster that I've ever entered. There's weighting to it, so there's a recency bias and stuff like that, but you have one pollster, and the pollster has some consequential misses, like Quebec, the Quebec Solidaire and the Conservative Party numbers, which I think there's a reason why these two missed. I think that there's been some discussion about why Main Street underestimated the Quebec Solidaire and overestimated the Conservatives so much. Now, only Main Street knows, because they're the only ones who have access to their data, and they haven't revealed it. Their argument was turnout reasons, and it's paywalled by iPolitics, which is the paper that Main Street partially owns, or is partially owned by. Doesn't matter. So I don't know the exact reasons of it, but the gist of my understanding of the article, not having paid for it, is that they're basically arguing that people didn't turn out. I.e., they polled people, they said this, and they didn't turn out. That actually seems like a very plausible reason, especially if you follow U.S. polling. The U.S. polling does registered voter polls and likely voter polls. Typically speaking, the farther from an election you are, people tend to skew towards registered poller, and closer you try to skew towards more likely voter, because it's easier to try to forecast likely voters the closer to the election it is. And the reason for this discrepancy, is why you do these two things, is a lot of these polls are done by telephone, and not everyone you call will actually vote. They might have a preference, but they might not vote. And it seems likely that Main Street thinks that they called a bunch of people who have preferences but don't vote, which actually does fit with their track record from 2021 in Canada, where they wildly overestimated the People's Party, as with a couple other telephone pollsters specifically. And that would make sense. Ecos, another telephone pollster, wildly overestimates the Quebec Solidaire here, and wildly underestimates CAQ. Now, you might think, oh, you can't consider telephones because that's a completely different miss. No, I think it is the same reason. I think it's the case that the telephone polls in Canada are getting voters who don't intend on voting. That's why the telephone polls, Ecos and Main Street here, which have big misses on specifically Quebec Solidaire and the Conservatives. No one else other than Angus Reid, but Angus Reid, I can't explain Angus Reid's miss, honestly, because this is embarrassing. This is terrible. It's likely the case that Quebec Solidaire and Quebec Conservatives, who skew younger, who skew more radical, who skewed more disaffected, were less likely to vote than the Liberals, Parti Québécois, or the CAQ, who skew older, skew more trust in the system, and more affected, less disaffected. Less disaffected doesn't sound right, but I guess that's the best way to say that. So it's likely the case that if Main Street continues to do telephone polling, which I think they should, because you can do good with online polling, don't get me wrong. Ledger did really good in this election. And Research Co. did solid, and Sigma, I think, also did online polling, and they did good. So you can definitely do good with online polls. But it's very much the case that telephone polls likely need to do likely voter screening, because online polls, by definition, already have that. The clincher with an online poll, and the reason why I say online polls by definition already have a likely voter screen, is because only very politically active or interested people are in the panels that online polls poll. So someone who isn't going to vote is likely not going to sign up for those panels. The problem is with online panels is they're not representative. So if you have demographics that are more likely to be in online panels, you're going to get distorted numbers. And I think this is my explanation for the Angus Reid numbers. This is not what they said. This is my post hoc rationalization of their miss, because their miss is really bad. I suspect Angus Reid's panel has too few francophones. And I bet a lot of the francophones are not nationalistic. When the majority of francophones, almost like 70 or 80% of them, vote for sovereigntist parties, so most of the francophones in Quebec are nationalistic. I think their panel doesn't have enough, because it's not just that they underestimated the CAQ, they've also underestimated Parti Québécois. So the people from Quebec who signed up to Angus Reid's panel don't seem representative of Quebec because of this. This is a big miss. Collectively, for sovereigntist parties, they have... What's the math here? I don't want to do the math. Now I'll do it. 62 versus... Oh, that's actually a lot easier than it is. 71 to 62. So they have a 9-point collective miss on these three parties. And they collectively overestimate the Federalist vote from just shy of 27.3 to just shy of 35. So almost the exact reciprocal result. And arguably this other might also be Federalist parties, like the Canadian Party of Quebec or Bloc Montreal, getting more votes. So it looks like to me that Angus Reid's panel is likely, because it's generally speaking an English language panel, maybe it does offer French, I'm not sure. It might be the case that they're getting a skewed view of Quebec, because Angus Reid doesn't typically do bad at Canada as a whole. Or even some western provinces, like Alberta, it does pretty well. But it really did terrible in Quebec here. This is a terrible result. 16 is huge. And you might note that these are smaller than other mean squared areas I showed before. I actually screwed up on the Ontario postmortem, or the Canadian Conservative Party postmortem. I forgot to divide out by number of parties here, so my mean squareds were wrong. Oops. So that's how the pollsters did. So the pollsters did relatively well. So how did I do compared to other people? So I have Main Street here, but I don't have them by region or the seat count, because I couldn't find the model afterwards. Probably could have looked harder, but wasn't that important. And I don't have 338 by the sub-regions, because I didn't think to write down his numbers on October 3rd. And he has since then updated his website. And the Wayback Machine is not working properly. It's not giving me the map results. So I can't actually get his regional numbers and transcribe them to my current definitions of these 3 regions. So I'm just blanking it out. He does have them. And if you can get the Wayback Machine to work, you can look at them. But it's not working for me. But Quebec overall, 338 did fantastic. A mean squared error of 1.4, seat hit rate of 94.4. I should note that even though I think personally not particularly good, I have a seat hit rate of 90%, because it's really hard to miss when the opposition is this divided and the CAQ is this dominant. So, my seat hit rate looks good, but I don't think I did particularly good, because my mean squared error is 9.4, which is why I consider popular vote mean squared error, generally speaking, more useful metric than seat hit rate. Except in the situation here where you see too close to call, he has 96.8% seat hit rate, 3.2 mean squared error. I think that's comparable to 338. Because getting up in the high 90s is hard. I think here, I don't recall the exact math. Let me just recalculate here. Just a second on the other screen. Yeah, too close to call missed 4 seats. Like, that's pretty low. Now, 338 only missed 6, so I'm not talking like 338's trash here. They're both really good. And why I think you definitely should look them out. I don't have Main Street seat hit rate because it's probably not particularly good. I think they're forecasting the CAQ more dominant than I was. But, well, as what it is, they do definitely have a better mean squared error than me, if you do it by raw. So I now have these 2 error columns here. So just to explain this one, error star, is what happens if you do the adjustments I've done to my model since then. And don't, because I will note here, a big portion of my error is I missed the last 4 polls. So we go here. I didn't get this forum poll. I didn't get this research co poll. I didn't get this Main Street poll, and I didn't get this ledger poll because I couldn't get a PDF for this one before my final forecast. And these all came out the last day after my video on Sunday released. And for accountability's sake, the projection I'm going to compare to is the last one I made publicly available, which is the Sunday, October 2nd video. So using the polls, without using the extra polls that I've missed, just doing this correction here, I should copy that there because they had the same hit rate. Doing this correction, how I'm handling the corrections I'm doing, which is principally urbanicity. Let's see, what were the exact changes? Just reading my notes over here. Okay, so I did 2 big changes to how I'm calculating urbanicity, which causes error star. The first one is previously I was reducing the impact of urbanicity because the way I'm doing the math, when I first implemented this following Ontario, I wasn't sure about because of the significance. Okay. Long story short, the result here is I've actually stopped reducing the significance. It is just the straight significance. That doesn't really mean much, but I don't really want to show my code. Long story short, I was halving the percent difference because of the... I won't get into it because it's a bit complicated. I don't really want to reveal too much about how the back end works. Long story short, I was reducing the significance of it. Turns out that wasn't a good idea. Well, there we go. I fixed that. And I also changed the definition of what is rural or urban because I'm doing this by writing right now. And I have come up with better ways to do it a little bit. It requires much more bespoke model stuff. So every single election is going to use a slightly different definition of rural and urban because, particularly you can see in the US states, some US states have very big counties and some have very small counties, so you can't use the same population density thresholds because, for example, Maricopa County, Arizona, that's definitely an urban county, or at minimum a suburban county. But there's a lot of it that is mostly empty. Phoenix is in it. Phoenix is a big city, but Maricopa is huge. So it doesn't look like a big city. It's just one example. So that's what error star is. It's a relatively small correction, but it's an important correction because it improves seat accuracy. The other one, error star, is what happens when I include the last 4 polls I missed. And I will note, I still don't actually ever actually got the Sigma poll here because I could never find a PDF of it. I could see the headlines, but the headlines weren't very useful for me. Now, with the last 4 polls included, my results suddenly become decent. I'm at about 4. So I'm actually better than Main Street now, so huzzah. Too Close to Call and 338 still beat me, so that kind of sucks there, in that I lost. Feels bad. But overall, if you add those 4 polls in, and you do this correction, my model is improved, and I do better. And this becomes an acceptable result, and this is like, not great. Not great. And I will note, too, this is just how my model works. I was never going to do as good as, say, Too Close to Call or 338 here, unless the polls were perfect on the conservatives, and, well, they weren't. Because I don't know, the conservatives are so new and so previously haven't been polled distinctly from other, that I couldn't correct for how the polls overstate conservative support. So this was an election where I was just basically, not exactly, but mostly taking the numbers, the conservative support numbers at face value. And that causes me to overestimate them because I underperformed polling. Similarly, the Parti Québécois and Quebec Solidaire stopped underperforming polling. Is it because the pollsters corrected their methodology and did better? Probably, actually. So, my model assumed the pollsters were worse than they were. They were better. So my model partially, intentionally underestimated the Quebec Solidaire and Parti Québécois because historically they underperformed polling. Oops. My model also does overestimate the CAQ because typically they've overperformed polling. And you know what? I stand by that because, yes, by the time you get to this one, I'm overstating by 1.2, a bit much. But at the same token, other than Main Street, I do better than Too Close to Call or 338 when it comes to forecasting the CAQ, so I stand by that methodology. My numbers would likely be better if I wasn't understating, if the polls missed Quebec Solidaire and Parti Québécois as much as I was estimating them. But next, assuming the polls stay this good, 2026, my model should be even better if it's these 6 parties. That's 5, but you know what I mean. My sub-regions here, I don't have seat hit rates because it was too much effort to count it. It's kind of lazy, I know. Long story short, almost all of my seat misses are rest of Quebec or Montreal. There is 1 in Quebec City proper, 2 with the uncorrected and 1 with the corrected. Too Close to Call has 0 misses in Quebec City and a few in Montreal and the rest of Quebec. So there's that. So what these subregions, right? So we don't have 338 because I couldn't actually get his numbers. So Montreal, my raw numbers, tolerable. 10.6. Now, you might be like, how is that tolerable? 10.6 is worse than 9.4, which you didn't like. Well, subregions are harder to get right than national regions. All of Quebec is going to be more accurate than Montreal. Because all of Quebec is, for lack of a better term, it's a one-level polling approximation. I'm doing some math on it, but it's only one level of math. This, by region, is created by forecasting electoral districts. Forecasting electoral districts has a huge margin of error on it compared to Quebec as a whole. And then you add up all those electoral districts that have huge margins of error, you're going to get a huger margin of error here. Because I don't forecast Montreal, I forecast the 33 counties that I consider Montreal, which includes Laval, for context. So this isn't the number calculated by Montreal, forecasting Montreal. This is the sum of 33 districts, so there's a higher margin of error on this. So 10.6, not bad. Here, for Too Close to Call, this one is if we just take his Montreal number at face value. It's 47.4. That sounds awful. I took his data, I transposed it to my definition of the regions, and we get this one, and it's 4.7. So, I don't know what's going on here, but whatever definition he's using of Montreal is different than mine. I think he's including some of the suburbs because he has the CAQ appreciably higher before you take my definition of Montreal. So I suspect he's including the suburbs of Montreal in his definition of Montreal. I'm just considering Montreal and Laval. If we go with error star or error star star, we get better results, which should be expected. This one increases the importance of density effectively, and this one has more polls. By the time we get here, that's actually a very strong performance. I'm very happy with actually a 4 on a sub-regional. That's really low. Like, that's a very good performance. And in fact, I actually do better in this regard than Too Close to Call in PV, but I do worse in seats. He has a better seat hit rate, Montreal. Quebec City, we kind of have a similar story. I have a 16 overall, which actually is not good. That's, for a sub-region, that's starting to get into the bad range. It's not a terrible range. It's not great. Primarily here, it's because I've overestimated the CAQ and the Conservatives to the expense of Quebec Solidaire and Parti Québécois, which shouldn't be surprising because I've missed a bunch of polls here with the basic projection that makes the CAQ, or that causes this. Okay. Interestingly enough, Too Close to Call with my definition of Quebec City does worse than with his definition of Quebec City. Weird, but that's okay. Overall, 9 or 11 is it's in the same ballpark of it's okay. If you do my error correction, just my model corrections, it's a bit better. And if you do with the additions of the last 4 polls, I do so much better. I'm at 5.8. I'm actually solid. And that, once again, feels good. 5.8 is a very solid for a sub-region. I have the same story here. I've underestimated the Quebec Solidaire and Parti Québécois. And now I've actually overestimated the Liberals, Conservatives, and CAQ. But the error of each category is lower. And this is mean squared error. So, because I will just note here, I've seen a lot of people for this particular election, for pollsters, do just mean error. Mean error is not a good way to measure this. Because let's do hypothetically, right? Let's say ECOS. Well, let's say we have a pollster, we won't pick on ECOS, that has everybody correct, except it has the Liberals up 5 and the CAQ down 5. Well, under mean error, if we just, the two versions of this, you have summed error and you have mean sum error, which would do the same acronym as squared version. Interesting. With 6 parties and 10 error under mean sum error, you get 1.7. Which means that this would have the same error as if we're just going to use 5 parties here. We're going to ignore other because it'll make the math easier. Now, if we just had the same 5 parties, but they were all collectively off by 2, well, then we have 5 parties, all off by 2, divided by 5 parties. Oh, we have 2 error. So that's saying being off everyone by 2 is the same as being off 2 by 5. Well, that's not particularly good because being off by 5 in an election is really huge. That's the difference between seats here, which is why my model was suggesting that Conservatives might win some seats, because if you look here, I was at 17.5. I was 5 percentage points higher. That's a big difference. Now, it was really only Pontiac, which probably was never going that way, but that's just different. That's just model assumptions being wrong. So the way I think you should be doing this is squared error. So in this situation, when we have 2 parties off by 5, well, then you have 5 squared plus 5. I'm bad at typing here. 5 squared divided by 5. We get error. Is that right? That's 5 to the power of 5. That's wrong. Then we get error of 10, whereas if we have 5 parties that are all off by 2, and we divide by 5, we have 4. I think this is a better way to capture it because, to me, being off by a little bit is a lot better than being off by... Being off by a little bit, a lot, is better than being off by a lot, a little. That makes sense. Bigger misses matter more, I guess. Now, finally, to just touch on the regions of Quebec, we have myself, 10.2, again, acceptable by just the basic model. I actually nailed CAQ vote share, so that's pretty cool. Too Close to Call has a 6, which is solid, and once you put my definition of what the rest of Quebec is, it's 2.8. That's amazing. That's really good. That would be a good result nationally. Or provincially, I guess, in this case. You put my error correction in here, I do worse. 11.1, which goes to show it's actually a good correction. The model correction is good, because a good model should overestimate and underestimate on average. Because you should have positive and negative errors. That makes sense. The only reason why you should have only positive errors for a party is if you're intentionally overestimating the party. That makes sense. And in this case, I pretty much was intentionally overestimating the Conservatives in CAQ because I assumed the polls were overestimating Quebec Solidaire and Quebec Parti Québécois. I was wrong in that assumption. And finally, if we add the extra polls, I go to 6.7, which is acceptable. So overall, with my corrections and with the extra polls I missed, I do okay. It's not the best result I've ever done. It's not the worst. If you don't allow me that, I did subpar. Well, that's great. So, what is the end results of this election, right? So, one interesting thing people probably want to know about is seats. So these are the actual seats. Because there's been some talk on this, if the Liberals and the Conservatives optimally vote split, or optimally strategically voted, what would it have done? Not much. We would see 27 Liberals, 2 Conservatives, but otherwise, not much different. Make that a bit more clear. The sovereigntist factions, that's backwards. There we go. The sovereigntist factions would still control almost the entirety National Assembly, so it really wouldn't matter that much. And this might be a bit surprising, but, well, it really shouldn't be. Again, like 71% of the vote went to these guys. So collectively, you would expect, even in a proportional system, 71% of the vote would yield them about 89 seats. So they get about 96, so they're 7 overperforming what a proportional would give collectively Quebec Solidaire, Parti Québécois, and CAQ. Now, by no means am I saying these two parties are the same, but they are all sovereigntist, and even though some people have spilled ink that sovereigntism is not the main issue in Quebec, it still is. It's just there's some disagreement now on what sovereigntism is. And separatism might be receding, but it's still not as significant as people thought. Parti Québécois got 14.6. It's only like 3 points down from 2018. And they're the separatist party, generally speaking. Though that said, Quebec Solidaire is also separatist. So the separatists still have like 30%. And just regular sovereigntists are at 41. So separatism/sovereigntism are still the main shtick in Quebec here. So how should we expect this to go forward? Well, since I was very wrong for most of the campaign on the Liberal seat show, I was a bit bullish on the Liberals probably not making it through this. But as we see here, they still have their solid base. It's not as bad as it looked, and I think the polls probably underestimated a little bit how much of the Anglo allophones they were getting. However, I don't know if the Liberals can actually recover from their losses on the Francophones. Because again, if we look here, and we just look at the votes by regions, Montreal, 34%, 7 Quebec, and 9 in the rest. And if we go here, I've broken up things a bit more. So we have Montreal, again, 33.9. I'll just make this a bit easier to see. Bear with me. I got raw data. Isn't that fun? So, again, Montreal, Laval, 32.9. The suburbs of Montreal and Laval, they're down to 12.5. And I think hindsight, as another thing I would change going forward, is I think I'm going to probably handle Montreal suburbs separately from the rest of Quebec. And I think that would also increase my accuracy, but it would be too much work to calculate the accuracy difference right now. It would require wildly changing the underlying data, how I've written it in. Quebec City is still 6.8, and the rest of Quebec goes into 6.9 for the Liberals. So outside of Montreal and its suburbs, they get about 6.8% of the entire vote. The Conservatives are about 9, let's say 0.4 in Montreal and its suburbs, which very similar to the Federal Party, for the record. And the rest of Quebec, they get about 21.7 and 14. So let's say some math in there. I think it worked out to probably 17 for the rest of the province. So they're nearly twice as popular in the rest of the province as they are in Montreal in itself. Liberals are more than the opposite. They're 80% of their vote is in Montreal and its suburbs. 80-90%, almost all of it. The party's been effectively, the Liberals, wiped out of everything that isn't this right here. Right here is pretty much their extent. Yes, you have Pontiac and you have a couple other ridings on the outskirts here that aren't in the sub-region here. But it's pretty much this sub-region, Gatineau, Pontiac, that's it. That's pretty much the extent of where the Liberals are. The Conservatives are pretty much here. This little circle here, so... In fact, if you looked at the federal map and you looked at the provincial map, that's pretty much where the Conservatives do in Quebec. Shocking, I know, right? Wild. So we're in a situation where the main opposition to the various flavors of sovereigntism are wildly distinct. The Conservatives in Quebec are quite conservative. They're more libertarian conservative, but they are much more conservative than most provincial premiers, even on non-libertarian things. And the Liberals in Quebec are kind of like the Liberals federally now, maybe a bit more centrist in them, but I would say they're firmly center-left, possibly left-wing. Or, sorry, I'll rephrase this. The Liberals federally are center-left, left-wing, and the provincials are maybe center-center-left. And it's not likely that they'll make much ground with the rest of it. And the association with Francophones, with this party being the Anglo party, likely will hurt them with Francophones. And this result will likely hurt their vote share with Francophones more, unless the next leader of the party, because I don't think Anglo can stay on with this result, can change this. If Anglade stays on as a leader, that's probably, the party's probably going to be stuck here. 20 might actually be close to their floor, seats that is, but I think their vote share is going to decline outside of Anglo ridings even more. Quebec Solidaire, or Parti Québécois, I think there is a very good argument that there might be some form of soft coalition formed between the two of them. Or some form of soft merger. I don't think it'll be an official merger. There's not going to be... Plamondon and Nadeau-Dubois are not going to sit down and be like, let's form a coalition or a new party. That's not going to happen. But I suspect one of these two parties, maybe not this next election, maybe not the next election, but if they're going to stay where they are politically, I think they will eventually soft merge because voters will leave one for the other. Because right now, you look at their second choice, the second choice by Parti Québécois and Quebec Solidaire voters are like 50% overlap. So I suspect one of those two parties will eventually, with the right leader and the right platforms, steal 50% of the voters from the other one. And that would cause the collapse of the other party, basically. Because right now, this is, first off, Quebec's still first past the post, so having multiple parties is still a detriment. You don't want that. You want to consolidate. So you have that consolidation force. And second, you have the case that two parties that are offering the same thing, but slightly different, are just going to divide the vote. If this was a proportional system, they'd both stay on just fine. They have enough brand to be different. But their policies are close enough and the voters are similar enough that I think you're going to see them merge somewhere. Maybe I'm inclined to actually say the Quebec Solidaire would merge, voters will switch Parti Québécois, which is a bit bold, I know. But the reason why I say that is the Parti Québécois has a less radical brand. And again, I'm thinking this is going to happen over the span of 4-8 years. I think Quebec Solidaire voters, as they get older and get less radical, which is typically how it happens, those tend to go hand in hand, will move Parti Québécois. This result, I think, is enough that Parti Québécois actually will be able to limp forward. And if I'm correct, in the next 4 years, and you actually see their vote share increase as Quebec Solidaire's vote share decreases, it might save or keep pushing the Parti Québécois along. They might pick up some seats back in their heartland again over here. And you might continue to see this trend going forward. So we really have two things. One, I think you're going to see Quebec Solidaire voters go to Parti Québécois slowly over time. It won't be a big grump. It'll be slowly over time. And eventually Quebec Solidaire might just be reduced to specifically the urban core of Montreal. At that point, I don't know if you're going to really see too many more flip over. I don't think you're going to see many Montreal voters. If we just move this over to the side, I don't think you're going to see many Montreal voters go to Parti Québécois. Maybe some, because again, Camille Lauren shows that the base of the Quebec Solidaire still likes Parti Québécois more. I'm just not so certain if that's going to be the case. But in a lot of the regions of Quebec, or Quebec City, I think you might start seeing that shift. And the other big one is the Liberals and the Conservatives. So this is the first election where the two parties really contested, so in a matter-of-fact way. So I think it's very much going to be the case here. The Liberals probably have hit their ceiling, and I think you're going to see most of the 7% outside of Montreal and its suburbs go Conservative. Slowly, over time. And if that is correct, I think what you might see is Pontiac and Gatineau might be the only areas outside of Montreal and Montreal suburbs that have meaningful Liberal vote share. I'm thinking that possibly Quebec City might even decline to less than 1%. The Conservatives, meanwhile, I think will gain Liberal vote share in Quebec City and outside of Montreal and Gatineau and Pontiac. But I think are going to lose vote share in Montreal because there are about 5 ridings in Montreal, 6 if you count the suburbs, that could have went Liberal if the Conservative vote split didn't occur there. And 4 years ago, those Conservative voters likely were from the Liberal Party. So I think you will see a bunch of them go back and hold their tongue, vote Liberal, because they don't want the CAQ winning. And in most of these cases, the CAQ picked up a seat because of this vote split. So either officially or unofficially, I think you're going to see a filtering where Montreal, its suburbs, and Gatineau, Pontiac are going to go more Liberal, less Conservative, and the rest of the province is going to go more Conservative, less Liberal, just because of natural strategic voting implications. People will see the results of the last election in their area, be like, I voted Liberal, the Conservatives almost won, I don't like the CAQ, I'll vote Conservative next time. Some places like Boyce North, I'll just get rid of this second, Boyce North and South are a good example of this. I fully expect, if all else being equal, 2026, Boyce North and South are going to go Conservative. All else being equal, turnout the same campaign, the same leaders, will go Conservative because Liberal voters there are going to vote Conservative, now knowing the Conservatives are almost winning there. Similarly, some of the ridings in Montreal are going to go Liberal because Conservative voters there realize they only went CAQ because of vote splitting. This might get helped along if the parties, Liberals and the Conservatives, make an unofficial or an official electoral pact and don't run candidates against each other. It would not be unheard of in democracies. It would be new and novel in Canada. We'll see how that goes. Personally, if you are a federalist in Quebec, which both the Conservatives and Liberals are, you should want that. Yes, I know, I did do the crunches and the numbers, and it only ends up winning 8 more seats for the Federalist parties, which is not going to change the outcome meaningfully. But if it wins 8 more seats, and then 2026 comes around, CEQ lose some votes, the Conservatives gain some, maybe the Liberals gain some votes. Well, you're in a situation where you might start seeing 10, 15 seats start flipping. Because, yes, only 8 flip, but it moves a bunch of others to very close. So it's very possible that a future election like this, 2026, might see some weird conservative-liberal coalition take power if the two parties decide to enact an electoral pact like this. The only reason I'm advocating for an electoral pact here is because I think fundamentally the Liberals and the Conservatives disagree on too many things. Like base policy issues. They're both Federalists, but they disagree on base voter issues, so it's going to be very difficult to keep the party together. You need a very strong, very charismatic leader to keep a coalition like that together. Whereas, if you just decide to accept that you're going to be a permanent coalition, it's much easier for the party caucuses to keep a parliamentary coalition together than it is for voters to vote for that separately. So, in other words, having a centrist leader is much harder to do and much harder to motivate voters to vote for than having a center-left leader and a right-wing leader who just so happen to coalition. This is not just idle speculation on my part, too. Germany, Italy, Hungary, a bunch of other countries have single-member ridings and parties that have formed an electoral pact like this. And the parties in these coalitions can be very broad. Now, historically, the ones in Europe that I'm thinking of, like CDU, CSU, Fidesz, KDNP, or the Italian right-wing coalition, they're all right-wing parties, but the difference between a NatCon party and a vaguely center-right party, like in Italy, is in a lot of ways very similar ideologically to vaguely centrist liberals and libertarian conservatives. That said, even with this, I think it's their best chance of winning in 2026. I don't think it will happen. Now, this is early. A lot can happen in 4 years. But unless Legault decides to retire or he somehow screws up really badly, I don't think he's going to lose. Yes, as I said, a lot can happen, but he seems to have hit the right mix here. He's very popular with a useful demographic with a very efficient vote. Francophone Quebecers really like Legault. They really like him. He's extremely popular. That's going to be very hard to overcome. And then to make that even worse, he's going to get a lot of beneficial energy in the next 4 years because the economy is likely going to improve. It sucks now, and in 2026, it'll probably be great. So, he's probably going to get buoyed by rebounding economies in the next election, and it will likely help him carry across the line. This is not certain. He might lose seats, but it would be very difficult for him to lose. He has the right coalition. And the other thing, too, is he can't just lose by a small amount. As long as the Parti Québécois and the Quebec Solidaire are getting, let's say, collectively around 10 seats, the CAQ will form government as long as they, plus those 3 parties, have a majority in the House, in the National Assembly. And that might never not happen. I won't say... I would discourage the idea of it never happening, but it'll be very difficult for those three parties not to form a majority every single election, barring wild voter inefficiency or a major change in the landscape. And especially since the CAQ is clamping down on immigration and basically English language, which is causing English-speaking people to flee, it might make it even harder for him to lose. But this starts getting into too much speculation, so I'll cut this off here. If you liked the video, by all means, like, share, subscribe. Let me know in the comments if you think I did bad, good, if you think my explanation for why I could have done better is adequate, or if you think I'm just off base with what I'm forecasting here. But otherwise, I'll bid you adieu, and I will see you Thursday, I hope, with a Senate update for the US, hopefully. Not super promising here, but I think there's enough new polls out that make it interesting, but we'll see. Otherwise, I bid you adieu.